When most people think of geopolitics, they imagine oil pipelines, steel tariffs, or rare earth minerals, not potatoes. But in Q2 of 2025, Canada quietly slashed its potato exports to the United States by 40%, marking a rupture in one of North America's most stable agricultural trade flows. Over 140,000 metric tons, enough to supply 17 million American households, simply stopped crossing the border. The trigger? A sharp 35% tariff hike imposed by the U.S. on Canadian potatoes, aimed at boosting domestic supply. Instead, it backfired. Prices surged across American supermarkets and restaurants. A 50-pound bag that once sold for $22 now fetches as much as $30. Fry portions shrank. Menus shifted. And underneath it all, something deeper was breaking. This isn't just a farming story. It's the early signal of a larger economic fracture. For decades, the U.S. had absorbed 92% of Canada's potato exports. That trade wasn't just about convenience. It was about integrated supply chains, mutual trust, and predictable logistics. But with this sudden tariff wall, Canada didn't hesitate. It pivoted, fast, toward Japan, South Korea, and Indonesia, toward its CPTPP allies. And in doing so, it quietly reminded the world, bilateral loyalty ends where bad economics begin. Welcome to Geocapitalist, where we decode global wealth, one power shift at a time. This is why Canada cut potato exports to the U.S. No one saw it coming. And what you'll see over the next few minutes may change the way you understand modern trade. In June 2025, Ottawa finalized a $1.6 billion CAD export agreement targeting key markets in Asia, specifically Japan, South Korea, and Indonesia. The 35% tariff the U.S. slapped on Canadian potatoes may have looked like a political power move, but economically, it was more like a self-imposed penalty. Unlike a corporate fine or a diplomatic sanction, tariffs don't punish the exporter directly. As one top comment on a related video put it bluntly, Canada doesn't pay a single penny of Trump's tariffs. Americans do. And that's exactly what happened. American retailers caught in a squeeze had no choice but to pass the cost along to consumers. Prices rose 8 to 12 cents per pound almost overnight. Restaurants began shrinking portions or hiking menu prices, and the ripple effect moved quickly, from rural Idaho diners to urban grocery chains across the Midwest. Tariffs have long been pitched as a tool to protect domestic industry, but in this case, they failed to account for the complexity of integrated supply chains. Canadian processors like McCain had pre-existing contracts with U.S. buyers. Canadian farmers in Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, and Alberta had planted crops based on cross-border demand. When tariffs hit, the entire supply logic broke. Farmers slashed planting by up to 25%. McCain quietly backed away from certain U.S. deals, and the trade relationship that had once been invisible, seamless even, suddenly became very visible, very fast. As prices continued climbing, American consumers began asking questions. And behind closed doors, Canadian exporters were already answering them, not with statements but with shipping containers headed west. While U.S. consumers were absorbing price hikes, Canada was sealing new doors. These aren't random partners. They're members of the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, a framework that Canada helped shape, and one that notably excludes the United States. Through it, Canada can export freely to a web of growing economies without facing the kind of trade friction now coming from the U.S. This move wasn't just opportunistic, it was strategic. Asian markets are rapidly expanding their demand for high-quality produce, and Canadian potatoes are seen as a premium input in everything from mass production to fine culinary applications. One viral comment said it best: Asian culinary professionals can now turn Canadian potatoes into works of art. This isn't just a feel-good quote. It reflects the broader truth that the value of a crop is no longer defined by its raw cost, but by the ecosystem it's embedded in. Canada is aligning itself with fast-growing, high-value food economies and leaving behind the volatility of American protectionism. But this pivot also comes with logistical risks: longer shipping distances, higher coordination costs, and a reliance on global shipping infrastructure that's already under strain. Still, the calculation is clear. Canada would rather manage new challenges with willing partners than fight uphill against old ones. And, as the first potato containers left Vancouver bound for Yokohama, the message was unmistakable. The age of passive trade alignment is over. What's happening with potatoes is just the tip of the iceberg. Canada's sudden redirection of exports away from the U.S. is exposing deeper structural vulnerabilities in the North American supply chain, ones that have been building quietly for years. For decades, Canada relied on a predictable rhythm: grow, harvest, and export across the border. But when tariffs hit and cross-border trust eroded, that rhythm collapsed, and with it, so did planning at every level. Canadian farmers weren't just selling potatoes, they were also buying American fertilizers, machinery parts, and processing technology. As the potato trade began to fracture, these upstream inputs started showing signs of stress. On the U.S. side, restaurants dependent on steady volumes of Canadian potatoes scrambled to find replacements. Some turned to domestic sources, but others simply cut back. Menu prices rose, portions shrank. Meanwhile, American producers, already stretched thin by labor shortages and climate volatility, couldn't scale production fast enough to fill the gap. This single tariff decision sent a cascading signal. North American food trade is no longer immune to political interference. Think about it. First milk, now potatoes. Canada's turning its back on the U.S. one crop at a time. And they're not wrong. Quietly, sector by sector, Canada is uncoupling. Not through grand speeches or confrontational headlines, but through spreadsheets, shipping routes, and crop rotations. What's more alarming is that this breakdown isn't just about potatoes. It may be foreshadowing similar fractures in grain, meat, and dairy. Because when trust goes missing in trade, everything else becomes negotiable. The irony of the potato fallout is that the people it was supposed to protect are the ones now footing the bill. The 35% tariff was pitched as a strategy to support U.S. farmers and reduce dependency on imports, but it didn't deliver on either front. Instead, it triggered higher input costs, tighter margins, and an invisible tax on millions of American families. What was framed as economic nationalism ended up behaving like fiscal sleight of hand. A sharp YouTube comment captured this contradiction perfectly. This is not about trade, it's about two things. One, bullying, because apparently it's fun, and two, raising taxes while pretending to cut them. That might sound blunt, but the numbers back it up. Retail prices for potatoes jumped from $22 to nearly $30 per bag in some regions, a spike of over 35%. For restaurant chains, the price hike triggered a domino effect. Side dishes got smaller, combos changed, and cost-conscious consumers began noticing. Meanwhile, Canadian producers were stabilizing. Domestic food programs absorbed some of the supply. Asia picked up the rest, and the public message from Ottawa was clear. Canada isn't going to wait for its largest trading partner to figure itself out. For years, the U.S. enjoyed privileged access to Canadian agriculture without paying much attention to the balance. That era is over. The numbers don't lie. And neither do the empty shelves, smaller fries, and rising prices. The real question now isn't about potatoes. It's about what happens next when trust in trade starts to rot from the inside out. While the U.S. tries to tariff its way into agricultural dominance, Canada is quietly leaning into multilateralism. As a founding member of the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, Canada already has open trade access to key markets in Asia and the Pacific. No tariffs, no retaliation, just streamlined exports. And, in the potato standoff, this legal infrastructure became Canada's pressure valve. When the U.S. slammed the door, Japan and South Korea opened theirs. Canada and Mexico don't need to rely on selling to the U.S. They're part of the CPTPP, giving them access to a much broader trade landscape. That's the part many policymakers in Washington seem to miss. For years, the U.S. assumed its size guaranteed loyalty. But in a global trade environment built on efficiency and predictability, no economy, not even Canada, will stick around for punishment, especially when more respectful buyers are waiting at the dock. At a geopolitical level, this isn't just a story about potatoes. It's about trust, redundancy, and how nations manage risk. The CPTPP gives Canada leverage, the kind that makes retaliation optional and counterbalance easy. Meanwhile, the U.S., having withdrawn from the TPP under Trump, finds itself increasingly outside the very agreements that could have cushioned its supply chain shocks. The result? The U.S. is playing defense in a trade world that's already moved on. While it talks about self-sufficiency, its neighbors are building trade architectures designed to outlast individual presidencies. And in the quiet corridors of economic diplomacy, that kind of permanence speaks louder than tariffs ever could. This isn't just about food. It's about frameworks. Canada's redirection of potatoes away from the U.S. responded to a pattern: milk, timber, now potatoes. Protectionist policies have created bottlenecks and distrust. North America is no longer acting like a unified economic bloc. Canada isn't isolating. It's diversifying, aligning with Asia, reinforcing local food resilience, and strengthening its bargaining power. The U.S. is becoming the outlier, stepping away from global trade deals and imposing tariffs on partners. The cost is growing, not just in dollars, but in credibility. What happens when grain, dairy, or energy follow? This is about who still believes in trade that works. The longer the U.S. treats its neighbors like rivals, the more doors will close. Potatoes have become a mirror reflecting the fragile state of North American trade. This was a moment of recognition. Long-standing partnerships can buckle under short-term thinking. Every trade breakdown chips away at the credibility of the U.S. as a reliable trade partner. Canada's pivot strengthens an alternative system, one that doesn't rely on Washington's mood swings. A North American economic model that once seemed unshakable is starting to splinter. If a root vegetable can expose that, what else is just beneath the surface? Will the U.S. double down on tariffs or recognize that respect is a more powerful currency than control? A 35% tariff on potatoes revealed a turning point in North American trade, a shift away from reliance on a volatile partner toward multilateral agreements. The U.S. set the rules. Today, those rules are being rewritten in shipping routes and spreadsheets. What happens when dairy, grain, or even clean energy follow the same path? The world isn't waiting for the U.S. to recalibrate. Watch our next video and subscribe to support our work. Let us know in the comments, is North America breaking apart or just waking up? This was Why Canada cut potato exports to the U.S. Thanks for watching.